we're going to kick off with Mission Blueprint. And this is really where the journey of measuring your mission begins. And it's something that we are really excited to dig into with you today. We're going to build on the exercise that you did with Sean just now, and get a little bit more specific with our question. We'll have a little bit of independent writing time, and then we'll share out full groups. So we won't break out into groups, but we will hear from each other about our answers to this question. And the question is, why do nonprofits struggle to measure what's most vital to their mission? So now narrowing the focus a bit to what's most vital to their mission. Why do nonprofits oftentimes struggle with even that? Take a few minutes to jot down or refine your thinking from earlier, and also consider what feels like is at the root of that answer. Take 2 minutes, and then we'll come back and share full group. Take a few more seconds, get that last thought down. All right, and now I'm going to open it up for share outs. Why do nonprofits oftentimes struggle to measure what's even most vital to their mission? Who wants to kick off?
I will go ahead because once I answer this question, I'm going to be gone for about an hour and then I'll return. I have another meeting to be participating in. But when we had our breakout session, one of my thoughts was is that individuals and or organizations don't necessarily have the tools and or maybe they are unsure about how to measure some of those things that are important to their organization.
Absolutely. Thank you, Don. Who else?
One of the things I was thinking about, I mentioned this in my breakout group earlier, I tend to kind of think in frameworks. The way I was sort of thinking through this, I think there's an individual component to this and a collective or team dynamic. So I think on the individual level, there's perhaps a failure to identify and even internalize and embrace what is most vital to the mission. I think on a collective level of analysis, it would be there is perhaps there's not a shared understanding of what that vital value is. Absolutely. And then I think like more practically thinking like on like there's perhaps an issue like there's a failure of value of data in particular. Mm-hmm. Meaning people will lean too much into their intuition to it's the higher value than more objective metrics. And finally would just be whoever just shared before this, I didn't see, would be I think kind of the skills. They lack the commensurate skills to measure and to make change based on data driven value sets. So that's kind of the framework that was building in my mind.
That's great. That's great, Jake. We talk about oftentimes how it takes a certain level of courage from the group to really say, these are the data points that matter the most. And these are the things that we want to make sure that we're measuring. That can be really difficult to do, and really requires courage to say, this is what matters the most. How about a few others?
I'll add on to that because I think, something that I was writing down was that sometimes what we think is vital, we like, at least in our organization, we feel like it's harder to quantify or harder to measure. So if we're looking at personal growth of founders or of people we serve, of systemic change, it's like, how do you, figuring out what do you measure, what's the outcome that shows this is happening, versus a lot of times the things that partners and sponsors and grantors ask are like, how many people are you serving over X time frame? Like, it's more about volume than either quality. And so in our experience, I think it's like, well, we really care about this personal and inside and systemic change. Like, and maybe we don't know how to measure that. Or
Absolutely. Thank you, Brooke.
I think in our case,
Oh, Linda, you were off mute and now you're back on mute. Linda, you are still on mute. I'm going to ask you to unmute. See if
okay, sorry.
No worries.
I know funding for us, I mean, it seems that funding in order to get funding, they are so data driven, and we have to try to collect so much relevant data that I think the personal part of our Healthy Moms and Babes mission anyway gets lost in the struggle. Recently we lost our VAN program lost 50% of its funding, which was $75,000. So that puts a crunch on us. It puts pressure on us to show how we're relevant out in today's world. And we know that we're very relevant because our clients tell us that we're relevant and how much they appreciate what we do. But what we do out in the community doesn't really transfer into like our grant writing or whatever. So that's where I struggle. And I also think sometimes, you've heard the expression, too many cooks spoil the stew. Sometimes I think there's too many people involved instead of having someone to help us focus. We all know what our mission is. Our biggest mission is making sure that this city has healthy full-term babies, people with good prenatal care, good support systems in place, so on and so forth. So that's where I need help. It's just trying to get somebody to focus on that and to get our whole agency focused on that one thing. Like, this is what we have to work on, and this is how we're going to do it. And sometimes it's just difficult to get that done.
Absolutely. And I think, Linda, you're hitting one of the things that we've learned in working with so many nonprofits, and what has really been a driver of this entire program is that lack of focus and that draw to different data points that need to try to be everything to everyone, whether it's due to funders or internal purposes. The ability to find focus and really identify what is most vital to the organization can be just a real challenge.
Yeah, it is.
So absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So with that, I kind of want to frame how we arrived at this question. Our journey in the nonprofit space sort of led us here to ask this question to a ton of nonprofits over the years. And here were some of the things that we learned, and here's some of the things that we've helped them to address. And we're hearing a lot of these responses in what we just heard. So the first most common thing that we hear is just kind of what we're getting at in a little bit of a few different ways. The first is just this lack of clarity around programmatic metrics, the ones that matter the most. And again, because this requires courage, it requires mental discipline. We heard several people say, it's just Brooke said, it's hard, right? It's sometimes it's just, we don't know how to measure this. This is really challenging. And we've seen so many organizations work to try to get to a perfect place of the perfect measurement, only to lose focus on it because of how difficult it is and wind up not measuring anything, or at least anything meaningful. And it can also stem from this clearly defined vision, and instead of programmatic metrics. The second piece is that misalignment. So Jake was hitting on this a little bit, but the ability then, even if you have a certain set of core metrics in place, the ability to align your whole team around it and say, yeah, we all believe that this is what matters. Oftentimes, frontline staff think that the data that they're collecting is meaningless, right? We're nodding our heads here, because that frontline data, right? Those frontline staff members, they know the data points that matter the most, right? It's great that we have a few of them on the call today. So the ability to align your whole team around what those data points are that matter the most is a separate challenge. Execution. So once you've done those two different things, it's difficult to execute this. So from a process perspective, can you actually get the data? Do you have the tools? Do you have the efficient process? Do you have the effective process that brings in data that's actually accurate, right, and complete? So there's this piece with difficulty in execution, and then a lack of discipline. So in a world of chaos and COVID, we are drinking from the fire hose at times when it comes to different priorities that are thrown our way, whether we want to have to address them or not. And so it can be really hard in the midst of a world where there's just a lot going on to stay disciplined about measuring what matters the most to your organization. And so over the course of the next 2 days and into the coming months, we'll help to work to address each of these. But what we found was at the root of a lot of those conversations, we did interviews with nonprofits, but we also, arrived at some of this through research and through, ongoing work in the space, is this feeling that you have to be all things to all people. And this is really what I felt like I was hearing in Linda, where, you feel like your responses to a lot of things are, I have to do this because that funder is requiring me to include this data point. Or it's all important. We care so much in the nonprofit space. We care about all of our stakeholders. And so it oftentimes feels like everything is important. Or I can do both. This is the one that I'm most guilty of. It's always the both and for me, right? Like I can do both. And sometimes that's detrimental to actually being able to do what's most important. So we'll kick off the mission blueprint is really with this mindset to say, let's move away from the mindset of what we call the non-essentialist and consider a different mindset, a mindset of the essentialist. And this comes from a book called Essentialism, but that we've really embraced and think is a fundamental mindset for adopting a mission blueprint. But it really kicks off with the idea that you have to have a disciplined pursuit to this idea of less but better, fewer but even stronger. And the replacement mindsets are I choose to. So you have power as the leaders within your organization to choose certain data points. Only a few things really matter. We've all heard of the 80-20 principle. This applies and we know it. But sometimes it's hard to maintain that mindset of only a few things really matter. And then this empowering statement around, I can do anything, right? But I can't do everything. And this is just a fundamental reality that we have to live with. So as we think about Mission Blueprint over the course of the next several hours, we're really going to embrace this mindset of the essentialist. Here's a few other bottom lines that we sort of want to capture today. I love the busy note taking. Again, you have slides, and I know that I'm moving fast, but the essentialist, they think almost everything is non-essential. They're able to distinguish the vital few from the trivial many. So when you think about that logic model that has 400 metrics, I hope not 400, but maybe 100 different outputs, inputs, outcomes, short and long term. You've got to distinguish what's most vital. And then understand that sometimes choosing what not to do is just as important as choosing what to do. So our bottom line, sort of kicking off here, is to escape that culture of all things are important. We're going to push the group today to embrace the mindset of the essentialist. So our objectives for the next, what will be from now until around 2 o'clock, are threefold. One, we're going to embrace that mindset as a core strategy and mindset for measuring your mission. We're going to examine this idea of an impact flywheel and the value of superior stakeholder engagement. And that's going to really push us to think, why does the data matter? What is the real impact of being able to measure your data? And then third, we're going to build our mission blueprint. So we'll begin drafting and spend a lot of time in our work groups building out the mission blueprint. Our agenda looks like this. We're still probably shooting for a break around 11 o'clock. And like we said, we'll stick with the 12 o'clock lunch. So now what I'm going to ask you to do in your participant guide is turn to page 5, whether that is soft copy or hard copy. Turn to page 5. You should see a document that looks like this, or what you see on the screen there. And this is an example of a mission blueprint. It's an example of a mission blueprint for a 5 through 8 middle school. And we specifically selected the middle school example because you don't often think of a school as a nonprofit, but in many ways it is. And we also have some educators on the call. So we thought this was a great example to share. We're going to spend the next several minutes looking at that blueprint and answering a few different questions. The first question is, what do you notice about this blueprint that is effective? What resonates? And then the second is, how does it embrace the way of the essentialist, knowing what you know about schools? We've all gone to middle school before. We can maybe imagine what it might be like to lead one or work for a middle school. How does this artifact embrace the way of the essentialist? Any questions before we begin? Okay, so take the next 3 minutes to examine the blueprint and answer these questions. All right, take 30 more seconds. All right, I'm going to bring us back together. What's effective about the blueprint and what resonates?
I think it's the clearly defined targets, long-term outcomes, short-term outcomes. It's very specific on ways they're going to determine what success is.
Awesome. Thank you, Kim.
I was gonna say I agree with what she just said, and also you can tell the things that they're really focusing on, and the blueprint, it just feels really focused and defined in everything that they're going to and planning on achieving.
Hi, this is Queen. I agree with the two ladies, but I also wanted to add, I just compared that to a survey that we recently took before we joined this call, and we had to do it as an agency, from our agency, and I noticed that it was different perspectives from everybody, and I'm not everybody that was supposed to be involved today, and I'm not sure if that's because of the position, the experience, or what, but what I see out of this, some questions that maybe we were told or maybe was determined, for example, a goal, we're a nonprofit, we don't have 5 or 10 year goals or a year goal. And I noticed if this is a nonprofit blueprint, this clearly addresses all of those things that was in the survey.
Absolutely. We appreciate that connection, Queen. You're spot on there.
I'd add too that the short and long-term outcomes are directly tied to the expressed convictions, mission statement, and change the world targets. You see, I mean, similar language, similar manifestations of the values. But I also say one thing that I think makes this effective is it's both qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative in the sense that it's measuring people through a process, but then quantitative, and then qualitative in regards to benchmarks. So ACT score, non-cognitive benchmarks, and that. So I think that makes it effective in that sense too.
That's great, Jake. Thank you for pointing both those pieces out. Because I don't think we hit on that in this next slide, but the alignment from section to section, that's very intentional, and we'll see how that works today. But the qualitative and quantitative pieces are very intentional as well. Liz?
Yes, what stands out to me is that it's not so much, like it's very concise, to the point, direct. It's not like there's this overwhelming amount of things. So that really stood out to me.
Absolutely. And schools aren't outliers here, right? Jay and Deanna, who are the educators in the room, schools don't, fortunately only have a few things to measure, right? This is really forcing those schools to think about what matters most and what they want to put on a resource like this. So when we think about this mission blueprint and what makes it effective, you're highlighting quite a few. So one, we heard right off the bat, it feels very focused. It gets at what's essential, what's most core to this school's mission. And you can see that because not only does it have mission and the beliefs on which that mission was founded at the very top of the resource, but to Jake's point, you can see the connection between those two and the change the world targets and the bottom, what we call the theory of impact, and the outcomes and the programs. So in all of this really spotlights the why behind the organization. So you should really be able to look at this document and understand deeply why this organization exists, what they're trying to do, what's so important about what they're trying to do, and get a glimpse of how they think about doing that with the bottom section. It's simple, hopefully fairly digestible because it fits on one page, and is intended to be an actionable resource as well. Something for your team to be able to see and say, I could actually take action on that if I'm, whether I'm an executive director, a board member, or any member of the staff, because I can see so clearly what is most important to us. And then this bottom point, and this is what really connects it to this journey of measuring your mission, is that it clarifies for organizations the most important things to measure. And the power of having those most important things to measure on one piece of paper are critical. And we'll continue to see throughout the course of the next couple of days why that's so important. I see a lot of heads nodding though as well. So this is our mission blueprint. In terms of the way that it embraces the mindset or the way of the essentialist, it really, this is the launch pad for, this idea of less but better. So it's sort of you saying, I'm going to commit to certain things and we're going to go after them, but I'm not going to commit to everything. It's distinguishing the vital few from the trivial many. There's a lot of things that you could track outside of this document, and a lot of things that you very well may track outside of this document. This does not mean that these are the only things that you track, right? These are just the ones that are at the organizational level that are most important. And that there should never be an excuse about, why you're not tracking them. And then it supports this idea of anything. We can do anything, but not everything. So what this resource does is it really answers through 3.5 questions. I use a couple of different questions just for I think a more clear way of thinking about this. But the first is, why do you exist? The second is, what are you trying to achieve? Or some folks like to think about it as, how do you know if you're successful? And then the third is, what will you do to drive success or make the impact? And that's that bottom section of it. What are sort of the core programs and the outcomes that you need to achieve in the short and the long term to really realize your mission? So we land here with this notion that with the essence of your mission in focus, once you have a mission blueprint, organizations take that first critical, monumental step in being able to measure what matters. And in our minds, this is really a requirement for being able to do this intentionally, rigorously, with the discipline you need to be able to do it consistently.
I agree.
Thank you, Queen. So we like to sort of take a moment to zoom back out, and I think it was it Monica maybe who or Linda who talked about the idea that what's the purpose of data? There can be data fatigue. Why do we really need to measure this information? We like to take a moment to sort of zoom back out and say, this is great, right? The ability to be able to measure what really matters is important, but why? Why? There's a greater impact here. And we want to take you along a journey that we've been on when it comes to the impact of this work. And we really think about the greater impact being around superior stakeholder engagement. And when we think about stakeholders, we're talking about everyone related to your mission. So from your frontline staff to your clients, participants, patients, students, to your managers and your leadership team and your CEO, to your board and your funders and that broader external community, right? The impact of this is that we can elevate stakeholder engagement tremendously when we're able to measure what matters and do the things associated with engaging that group in that information. And this really is driven by this sort of guiding belief, sort of core assumption, and that's that stakeholders, internal and external, are more likely to be engaged and feel empowered to advance your mission when these things are true: when the mission's clearly defined, when it's monitored regularly, consistently made the priority, and prioritized as the focus of what we like to call storytelling. And that can be how you talk about your mission internally and celebrate things, but also how you storytell outside and engage funders and board members. So there's this just tremendous impact when stakeholders are engaged. And so we talk a lot about how we think measure your mission is an impact accelerator. It's kind of jargony, right? Everybody's heard the term accelerator these days. It's like, what does accelerator really mean? Well, I'm going to show you what it means here because I used to be a math teacher. And accelerating rates of change is how I think about the language of an impact accelerator. So on the x-axis, we have stakeholder engagement. So this is, as you go across the x-axis, stakeholder engagement is increasing. If you look at the y-axis, you see sort of impact and long-term sustainability of the organization, again, increasing as you go up. So I want to ask the group here, what do you think the relationship is between the two? So if you were to draw a line, what would it look like? Would it be a curve? Would it be straight? Would it accelerate at one point or another? And so I'll give you a few for the non-math folks in the room, a few choices. Let's make this multiple choice. So you got A, B, C here. Which of these graphs do you think best represents the relationship between stakeholder engagement and impact and long-term sustainability? Take a minute, and then we'll do a little poll. All right, let's do a little poll to see where we're at. This is good data for us as well. If you think the relationship is this first choice, just go ahead and sort of give the virtual hand raise. Okay.
Where's that at?
So this is.
I don't see mine, but I go for the first one. I don't see the
Okay.
hand raised. Sorry.
Awesome. So a few. So it looks like stakeholder engagement sort of increases proportionally to how as stakeholder engagement increases, your impact and your long-term sustainability, that metric increases as well. How about the second one? Okay, we've got a few. And then how about the third one? Okay, we've got a few. So let's hear from the group, and we don't have to get one from each person, but who feels passionately maybe about which one of these feels like it represents the relationship between stakeholder engagement and impact?
This is Queen.
Yep.
So I chose the first one because I just felt like at the angle of stakeholder engagement and impact, where it comes together, the line is shooting straight forward and maybe up. And when I compared it to the others, where the line was, it wasn't necessarily at the meet. So it offered those different curves and balances, which my mind is telling me that that's where they disconnect that a little bit, or they're not fully connected.
Absolutely.
So that was my thought. And I could be totally off, but that's my Aquarius mind.
No, I think that's great. That's great. Others?
I'll share. I think, I don't know, again, yeah, could be wrong, but I resonate with the second one just because I see our stakeholders, it's kind of like they're just testing things out, they're kind of getting a little bit involved here and there. And once they experience and see the impact, or like they know they're a part of it, or they are convinced, or whatever it is, then I feel like it shoots up. Like they are, like all in between the funding, the engagement, the partnerships, the opportunity, like all of that opens up. So
that's great. And in the interest of time, I'm going to move us, but then if anyone, after we hear sort of what our observation has been, because this is really more of an observation, I'd love to hear from the group if there's any additional reactions. So we've also observed the second, and you heard Brooke really share, I think, a great sort of example of why we've observed this. So oftentimes we see a lot of nonprofits living in this yellow space. Okay, so where everybody's impact, from nonprofit to nonprofit, it's there. They're making an impact, and as stakeholder engagement increases or decreases, impact doesn't change a bunch. This is, a very common place to be. You go through your annual processes and you're always making an impact. And as stakeholder engagement sort of moves along the line, it might get a little bit higher as you go. But there's this moment when you have this tremendous amount of stakeholder engagement where it really begins to take off. And this is where we see sort of the top nonprofits living in a world where their stakeholders across the board, internal and external, are completely engaged in the mission. They know the data, they know the stories, they know why they're measuring things, they know why they're doing what they're doing. And so this is where we connect it to an impact flywheel. So I love the heads nodding. It's great data. I wish I was sort of there with you in person because we're stretching here. But how does this connect to a flywheel? So we're stealing from Jim Collins a little bit. For anybody who's read Good to Great, he talks about a flywheel and about how with imagine a massive, big old flywheel that's super heavy. And if you were to go up to try to turn that flywheel, it would be incredibly challenging to try to move it even a quarter of an inch because it's so heavy, and to be able to move it's just hard. And how, after one person does it, another person does it, it moves a little bit farther. And if you get a handful of people all trying to move it at once, it might move a foot. But if you get more and more people engaged in moving that flywheel, what you find is that over time, it starts to accelerate. And you get to a certain point where the next push just by one person moves that flywheel faster and faster to the point where it's moving almost on its own. And it creates this almost unstoppable momentum that has a tough time stopping. So we think about that flywheel as this part of the graph where the impact really accelerates. So you see the slope of this curve, right, increasing faster and faster, right when you get to this point where your stakeholder engagement is really, really high. And it's starting to get higher and higher because you have this community of people who are deeply engaged, again, from clients and frontline staff all the way through your board and your funders. So we sort of share this lesson and we share this idea around the impact flywheel because we think it's important to really deeply engage in the why behind this work. It can be really difficult to measure and identify what we need to measure and execute it. But if we're constantly grounded in the real purpose behind this, it can give us that additional push to persevere when things get tough. So we like to conclude here with this bottom line around, like a flywheel, continuous stakeholder engagement accelerates your impact, creating what can feel like an unstoppable momentum. And that unstoppable momentum is what we want all of your organizations to experience when as you're leading. So I'm going to pause us here. And I'd love to hear if there's any reactions, questions. We don't have a ton, we haven't built in a ton of time for questions. Usually that happens a little bit more naturally in person. So I will take a moment just to let you jot down a few notes, ask any questions or share any reactions, and then we'll move to the next section. All right. Well, I think that this is a great pause point.